you very much for allowing me to share all those thoughts with you. Now, let me turn it over to questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. Righty, I'm not sure whether you've picked up any questions from people or if people want to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to respond to them.
Well, before we do the question, maybe can we do the poll? We have
Sure, of course.
Question for the audience. Please participate in this poll. And you can also do your question in the chat box or in the Q&A box, whichever you prefer. I do have a question for you, Saul, from an audience in the live stream. And I copy pasted there for you.
Okay, so this question is, what alternatives could the government have had to closing international borders? Hasn't this action meant that there have been fewer transmissions of the virus into Australia than in other countries that haven't been as strict in controlling their borders? The answer to that's yes. For the first 12 months or so, at least, probably the first 12 months, the only strategy for for keeping the virus at bay and for maximizing the proportion of time that the economy was in effect open, at least to domestic transactions, was to do the sorts of things that Australia did, to impose social distancing type restrictions, some of which were particularly severe, and to limit strictly the number of people who came into the country and to require them to quarantine as we did. And it was easier for Australia and New Zealand and other island nations in the South Pacific and Taiwan and Singapore to do that than it was for countries that share land borders with their neighbours, as most of Europe, the United States and Canada and many other Asian countries actually do. Some countries chose not to pursue those strategies, either because they didn't believe the health advice or because their health advice, as in Sweden, was different, or because they feared that the costs of locking down, as Australia did, would outweigh the costs of letting things go. And I think the evidence is that the countries like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan until recently, which pursued the sort of strategies we did, ended up with better economic outcomes. In other words, there wasn't really a trade-off between lives and livelihoods, as some argued in the early months of the pandemic. But all of that really only holds true while there wasn't any alternative. And the point I'm making is that with the development and production of a range of vaccines, there is now an alternative strategy, which is to vaccinate as large a proportion of the population as you can with the most effective vaccines you can get as quickly as possible. And that's the strategy that a growing number of other countries are pursuing. And although the vaccines aren't perfect, what's clear from the experience of Israel, and now I think it's becoming clear from the experience in the UK, is that the vaccines certainly reduce the likelihood that if you do catch COVID, you'll end up in hospital or on ICU, and even more so that you'll die of it. And I think it will be increasingly clear that once a significant enough proportion of the population is vaccinated, and epidemiologists say that needs to be at least 75%, possibly 80%, then you can in effect live with COVID circulating in the community. And I think that's what we will see occur in other countries much sooner than it does in Australia. Australia made some other mistakes, including putting too many of its eggs in the AstraZeneca basket. I wonder whether they made that decision because Australia could produce AstraZeneca itself. In other words, was it a protectionist motivated decision rather than seeking to purchase sufficient quantities of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which we're now belatedly doing, but we should have done earlier. It worries me, as I said, that closure of the borders is popular. It's been popular at the state level, as elections in Western Australia, Queensland and Tasmania have shown. It's been popular in Victoria, as opinion polls appear to suggest. New South Wales, to its credit, I think, has pursued a different strategy, but we may see how popular that is as New South Wales grapples with the outbreak it's currently confronting. But in my view, the strategy which Australia has pursued is running pretty close to its use-by date. And if we want to sustain the good economic performance which we have had over the previous 12 months, as circumstances themselves change here and abroad, then I think if we continue with the strategy that we have had over the last 12 months, the economic costs of that relative to other countries are going to be greater. Now, there are a couple of other questions that I can see have come up here as well, so let me try and deal with some of those. Someone here asks, this is James Kirby asking, because our protectionist past was based on made-to-measure protection, e.g. for motor vehicles and textiles, and we don't have the breadth of manufacturing, but not in manufacturing industry. There's a bit more to that. If border closures ultimately accelerate the lead to yeah, I'm not sure what the rest of that question is there. Oh, sorry, that's Alex, is it? Yeah, I'm not sure. Alex, you might want to come back and tell me what the question actually was, because I'm not sure that I find one there. James Kirby is asking me, why is the CBA forecast of rates rising in 2022 premature? My answer to that is because although I think we will get to the so-called full employment levels of unemployment, as the Reserve Bank and Treasury now reckon them to be, sooner than the Reserve Bank appears to be forecasting, what I'm less convinced is that the lags between reaching that level of unemployment and wages growth starting to accelerate haven't shortened as well. Now, it would appear that those who are forecasting that rates might rise as early as the latter half of next year are working on the assumption that as soon as the unemployment rate gets down to 4.5 or less, wages growth will begin to accelerate. I think the description that Phil Lowe gave in his speech in Toowoomba last year about the mindset of Australian businesses, a much more relentless focus, as he called it, on controlling costs in the face of competition, is still an accurate depiction of the way most businesses are thinking. In the US, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that employers are willing to pay higher wages in order to attract people to jobs that they're finding increasingly hard to fill. But in this respect, I think the United States is different from Australia. In the first place, minimum wages are a lot lower in the United States than they are here, and there's more scope to raise them. Secondly, it would appear that people's willingness to take on jobs in the United States is in part constrained by the elevated levels of their equivalent of unemployment benefits that still apply until September than is the case here in Australia. And I think the cost containment mindset in Australia is now more entrenched than it had been, in part because of our experience with a much stronger currency during the first half of the past decade than has been the experience in the United States. So to sum up, although I think we will get to the sort of levels that will ultimately generate faster wage inflation sooner than the Reserve Bank thinks, I still think that there will be something of a lag between reaching that point and wages growth starting to pick up in a way that will feed into and produce inflation rates of 2 to 3%. I think that will happen sooner than the Reserve Bank has said, but I don't think it will happen immediately, which is why I think the most likely time for the first rate rise is the first half of 2023 rather than the second half of 2022. There's another question here from someone, which says, out of the slides, most of the slides you noted on one of the slides improved. Are there some more susceptible than others to the ills of protectionism? Well, the sectors that are benefiting at the moment are primarily retail sales, motor vehicle sales. The housing industry is clearly benefiting from the fact that people are spending more time at home, have more money to spend, want to spend it on either improving the homes they've got or in buying ones that offer them improved standards of living, more expensive or newer homes. So all of those sectors are benefiting from improved protectionism. The sectors that are hurting, of course, are the ones that are still experiencing the effect of restrictions on people coming in, which are tourism and education. The government is much more sensitive to the concerns of the tourism sector than it is to the concerns of the education sector. It's notable, I think, that along with the big banks, universities were the only employers who were denied access to JobKeeper payments. Whereas the government has, and I'm not criticising them for this, extended additional assistance to the airline industry and to parts of the tourist industry that have been particularly dependent on international tourists. There's obviously a fair element of the government's political considerations in the different treatment that's being meted out to the tourist industry and to the higher education sector in particular, but they're among the sectors that would be losing. More generally, however, I think businesses are going to be adversely affected by difficulties in getting skilled labour to fill positions that call for skills that they've usually relied on migrants for. Now, yeah, maybe there's some longer term benefit if that results in businesses being more willing to spend money on training new workers so that they do acquire the skills that are needed to do the jobs that call for those skills. But that's going to take quite some time for its effects to show, and it will require a significant change in the mindset of businesses. I think there'll be an ongoing cost if we choose to keep our borders closed for a long time, and even after we reopen them, keep the migration intake a lot lower than it had been beforehand. And they're the sorts of longer term consequences of protectionism that history tells us we will see if we persist with the new version of protectionism longer than we actually need to. Someone else is asking here, what are the top 3 productivity enhancing reforms that Commonwealth and state governments could introduce? Well, the Productivity Commission had a report called Shifting the Dial, which they published in 2017. There's another one that should be coming out in the second half of next year. And that went to some lengths to emphasise that the sort of things that governments could do to improve productivity now are different from the reforms that governments of both political persuasions pursued from the mid-1980s until the early 2000s. So, for example, having reduced tariffs significantly during that period, we can't do that again. You can't deregulate markets that are already deregulated. You can't privatise government-owned corporations that you've already privatised. And of course, not all of that turned out to have the positive benefits that were claimed for it, and the costs of some of those policies weren't necessarily ameliorated in the way that they should have been. But the new agenda that the Productivity Commission was talking about were, for example, reforms to the way health services are delivered, reforms to the education system and the way that's funded and delivered. In particular, the Productivity Commission emphasised, as other inquiries, such as the Henry inquiry into tax reform have done, the importance of reform to state taxation systems, and in particular, as every inquiry that's ever looked at this subject has recommended, replacing stamp duties on land transfers with a more broadly based land tax that includes the so-called family home. New South Wales, to its very great credit, is pursuing that reform. I think they're choosing the wrong transitional method by, in effect, giving people an option as to whether they pay stamp duty or land tax. The problem with that is that people will understandably opt for whichever results in them paying less tax. And that means, A, that the revenue foregone by the reform will be greater than it would have been otherwise. And secondly, that the reform will probably never happen, because those who think that they're going to live in the house they're buying for the next 25 years will choose to pay stamp duty. Those who expect that they'll only be there for 3 or 4 years before moving on will elect to pay land tax. And the way to do this is the way that I and 2 others recommended to the Victorian government more than 5 years ago, which is to say that the transition happens from, say, the beginning of the next financial year, but anyone who's paid stamp duty on a property they've bought in the last 3 or 5 years gets a credit against the land tax they would then have to pay for the stamp duty that they've paid in the 3 or 5 previous years, and that avoids the problem of double taxation. That was actually what David Thodey recommended to the New South Wales government at the time when he submitted his report. But unfortunately, the New South Wales government has gone down a different path, which I think they'll ultimately regret. But notwithstanding that, at least the New South Wales government is willing to act on this reform. The ACT government's doing it as well, although what they're actually doing is not raising or broadening land tax so much as raising municipal rates, which they can do because the ACT government is also the Canberra City Council. I think it's regrettable that the Victorian government, which obviously perceived the need to raise taxes in its most recent budget, didn't also seize the opportunity to reform its tax system in partnership with New South Wales, the other big state. That would have put a lot more pressure on the remaining states and territories to go down the same path. But unfortunately, Victoria has gone down a different direction. So there are some of the reforms that governments could pursue if they wanted to lift productivity growth. I'd like to think that the intergenerational report that the Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, is going to be presenting next week will put these sorts of things back on the agenda as well. Unfortunately, the intergenerational reports have been somewhat degraded by the overtly political vehicles they've become in the last 2 episodes, that is, the one produced by the Gillard government and then the one produced by the Abbott government under Joe Hockey. Both became vehicles for pushing the government's political agendas rather than, as Peter Costello originally intended, for having a long-term look at the consequences of trends such as demographic change on the government's longer-term budgetary position. Hopefully, the document that Josh Frydenberg will be presenting next week will be more in the spirit of the first 2 ones that Costello presented rather than the 2 more recent ones, and that could perhaps raise some hopes of more action on that front. Someone else is asking here, this is Alex again, just asking whether border closures is likely to see increased imports rather than local activity. No, I think what border closures are doing is preventing imports of services, which is the way the balance of payment statistics describe spending by Australians overseas on foreign services. That's a services import. Australia's border closures are seeking to substitute domestic spending on goods for spending on services abroad. Now, to be sure, some of those goods, in fact, potentially a lot of those goods that Australians are buying, such as computers, some furniture, motor vehicles and the like, those goods are, a lot of those are imported. So yes, there's an imported channel in that way. We don't make a lot of those things that people are now spending their money on. But the net effect, in my view, is one that is designed to substitute domestic economic activity, domestically produced goods and services for foreign ones. Hans van Pelt, nice to see you here, Hans. Thanks for that. Could inflationary pressure increase from significant increases in freight and construction industries? That's a question that's being toyed with around the world at the moment. There are very significant upward pressures on container transport costs, and in some other areas like semiconductors, the shortage of semiconductors is spilling through into increases in the prices of cars and a range of things like that. Most of these are perceived by the Federal Reserve and other central banks to be transitory, that they will pass as supply of containers, of semiconductors, responds to the evident increase in demand. That's not guaranteed in any sense of the word. But what we're also seeing is that not a lot of that is being passed on in the form of increased prices for consumer goods. A lot of it's being absorbed in the profit margins of whether it's manufacturers, wholesalers or retailers. Some of it will get through to consumer level, and for different reasons. Australia's inflation rate over the year to the June quarter is going to be a lot higher than it has been in recent quarters. That's partly because there were a number of negatives in the June quarter last year from falling petrol prices, from free childcare that will drop out of the annual inflation rate. So we'll have a temporarily higher inflation rate for the June quarter. There'll be some spillover effects from increased transport costs and costs of things that have semiconductors as an important element of them. But I suspect that those will pass by the time we get into 2022. I don't think there are any other questions, and we have just gone 6 o'clock. So I might just simply refer to the response of the opinion poll there, which you'll recall asked, should Australia begin reopening our international border once a significantly high proportion of our population has been vaccinated? I guess I have to say, given my views that are now clear, it's very gratifying to see that 95% of you think that we should. And it's understandable that 5% think that we shouldn't. If I were to take a sample of the broader Australian population, I suspect that the results would be, at least to some direction, the other way around. But can I say, in concluding, just before I hand back to Rati to wrap it up, thank you very much for being here this evening. Really appreciate it. We'll be doing more of these, and I hope that you'll continue to participate in those when they become available. Rati, can I now hand back to you just to close up for the evening?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Saul, for the presentation and for answering all our questions. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I do have a request. On your way out, can you please complete the survey for us? That will help us with how we're going to run our webinar in the future. And if you have any other suggestion and input, please feel free to contact me through our website and social media channels. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks, Rati.